All right, so good morning. It's great to see everybody out today. And as was mentioned in the announcements this morning, Joe's on vacation, and you got a whole week's worth of warning this time that I was going to be preaching today, so thank you all for still showing up. And hope you don't get too sick of the Kimmels, because I know you had Uncle Wayne last week, and then Dad's going to be on again tonight. So good luck with that. But in all seriousness, it is a blessing to be able to come here this morning and to preach to all of you. Earlier this summer, Joe had announced he was going to be going on a bigger trip this fall, and so the elders, as usual, were looking for people to fill in for him. And that made me start thinking on what I needed to talk on. I mean, yeah, it was a couple months early, but really that's always the hardest part, at least for me in getting a sermon, is trying to get a topic nailed down. Because once it's there, you know, it's a lot easier to put all the thoughts together, and then at that point it's kind of harder to know when to stop in order to get everybody out of here before it's too long, but yeah, once you get going. And as most of you know, Michelle and I were able to travel a lot this summer. One of our biggest trip this summer was out to Wyoming to see Yellowstone and Grand Teton. That's actually what the picture up there is from, one of our hikes there. And I don't really know how many of you guys are here this morning are hikers, but I really hadn't been too much before. I thought it was going to be okay because Michelle and I do a lot of running. It's really not. It's a completely different stress on those muscles with the elevation and the climbing. It is completely different. I was not ready at all. And then that got me thinking about, let's see what these buttons is. There we go. The verse this morning that Tony read for us from Isaiah. Thank you very much for that. Let's see. Yeah, I've often heard from this one, like it being on inspirational items at the Christian bookstore. You know, we all have probably those old bookmarks or the pillows or the wall hangers that they will be lifted up on the wings of the eagle. And during COVID, one of the lessons we watched at home on the computer was on Christian running and running a marathon, and that one pulled from the middle part of the verse. But this morning I'm focusing more so on the last clause, that they shall walk and not grow faint. I, to be honest, hadn't ever even really remembered that that was there until our summer Bible reading this time after we got back from that trip. It so happened to time out, and I'm like, you know what, that is actually a very good promise that we have there, because at the end of the hike that's on the picture a minute ago, that one was about 9.5 miles. By the end, I was very faint. And so from there, then some of Paul's comments came to mind, so drawing parallels between Christian walk and the experience of hiking, so it seemed like a pretty good fit today. A lot of my slides back there today are going to have some pictures from the hike to try to help explain my points from that side, and along with my usual practice of putting up the pictures, or sorry, not pictures, the passages that we're reading and studying from, and the outline points. Yep. And so by the end of the sermon, that will be at the bottom of the slide, for anyone who's taking notes. The first step of hiking isn't actually the first step of the hike. I'm sure most of you have heard the saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Actually, for hiking, it truly begins when you decide that you are going somewhere and you decide to make that first step. I know you're not actually out burning your calories and racking up the steps on your fitness trackers, but without planning, you would just be wandering lost in the wilderness like the Israelites when they were leaving Egypt. When we were deciding where to hike on our trip, there were a plethora of options to choose from. There were easy ones that were basically just walks outside at Fairy Falls in Yellowstone, or there was a more moderately challenging one at Jenny Lake, but you could make it easier. They had a boat that you could cut out like about half of it. Or the one that we're going to talk more about this morning was pretty strenuous up to Delta Lake, the one from the picture. Or there are some that are even more crazy, like at Devil's Tower, the one on that side up there. We just did the path around it at the bottom, but there were several people that just climbed straight up the side of that thing while we were there that morning. And yeah, I'm like, no, we're never doing that. So Michelle first found the Delta Lake hike, described on some websites as one of the better trails to see at Grand Tetons. Its description included moving across a couple of boulder fields. It was about 4 miles each way, and the last mile was described as being about 60 degrees of elevation. For reference, Devil's Tower is like straight up, so that'd be like 90 degrees. It's up there. But the beautiful views and the scenery at the end would make all of the effort worth it. Similarly, the path to heaven, or the Christian hike, if you will, begins with reading or hearing the gospel, as Paul mentions over there in Romans. But reading about the hike alone didn't convince us that it was going to be worth it to use up a whole one of our 3 days there at Teton. We hiked slow, and after that much effort, we would be dead for the rest of the day, especially at that elevation in the Rockies. The base was at about 6,000 feet. So the next step was asking other hikers we ran into what they thought of it and if they had done it, and any advice they'd have. One local we ran into called it a butt kicker. I mean, to be honest, those weren't his actual words, but those are the ones that I'm going to choose to use in quoting him. But he would recommend being very careful if we chose to go do it at all. Another group was adamant that we did have to do it, that the scenery at the top was just going to make all of the effort worth it. Similarly, Jesus told us ahead that our road as Christians was going to be hard, that it would try us, that the world would hate us, and that we still have to be able to keep going. But the joy that we have in Him should be evident in our lives no matter what trials we have as we go through here, that the people we see decide that they need to have it for themselves. As Paul mentions in Titus, that even the slaves there should exhibit Christ in such a way as to make others want Him in their lives as well. And similarly, David mentions the joy of his salvation being key in converting sinners in Psalm 51. And this joy was evidenced by Paul and his companion as they were locked in jail and still having the peace and contentment to continue to trust and continue singing in the jail cell there in Philippi in Acts. So after we had read about the hike and heard from other hikers, we decided to do the hike for ourselves. The next step was that we needed to make sure that we had all of the proper equipment and gear to take with us. So the most important thing to have with you on any physical endeavor like this is to make sure you have enough water or other liquids for hydration. In the Badlands, we did one. It was about a mile or so, but it was a short hike. It had a ladder, and then we went along a bluff to see the lookout over the Badlands. But the only problem was the one day we were there, it was 105 degrees in South Dakota in about the beginning of September or so. When we got up to the top, I opened up my Powerade that I had brought, and another lady up there offered us $20 to just take it from us right there, because they hadn't thought I had to bring any themselves. There, it jumped in. Certainly she wasn't quite as thirsty as the rich man that was wanting Lazarus to bring him the water in Luke, but it shows that you need to make sure that you have the planning that you need and the water that you need. And in the Bible, Jesus describes to us the water of life over there in John 4, and that we will never again be thirsty, so we need to make sure that we have that in our drinking of it. And then once you have enough water, the next thing you need is food. Stuff for snacks, lunch, and what have you. Climbing the 4 miles each way that day, my watch said I burned about over 5,000 calories. It was definitely not something to try to do on an empty stomach. We packed everything from peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to beef jerky to trail mix to cheese and crackers to try to have some kind of variety, and we ate through all of it on the way, and we still didn't really have enough. But as important as it is not to go physically hungry, it is even more paramount not to go hungry spiritually. Paul and Peter and the writer of Hebrews all tell of the need to be able to grow beyond the milk or the basics of the word, and to be able to digest and process the meat or the harder parts of it. Yes, when we were first converted, we need to hunger for the milk or the sustenance provided by the word, But as we continue in our walk, we need to be able to digest the harder materials and passages. For without this ability to dig into the harder parts of the Word, we will become malnourished and not have the energy to finish the Christian hike. Ensuring proper hydration and nourishment are of primary importance as you set out on any long hiking endeavor. And so then behind them is making sure that you have the proper gear. Yeah, there's the first Corinthians 1 from Paul. There we go. The gear is, namely, you can't hike up the side of a mountain in the same pair of shoes that you would wear to go to the mall or to go to church in. Taking some of those off-road onto the dirt trails with the roots and the protruding rocks, you wouldn't have the support you'd need, and most likely you'd end up even having a rolled ankle by the end of the day. Also, a regular school backpack, you'll notice they're all wearing backpacks in those. A regular school one isn't built well enough to carry the weight and distribute it of all the water and food that you need. Once we tried that at Disneyland, where we weren't hiking, but the water bottles there each cost like $5 a piece in the park, and we were drinking about 10 that day, so we chose to carry ours in, and it did end up killing that backpack. It broke the strap pretty badly by the end of the day. So we needed to make sure that we had the proper gear there, and several others even chose to have hiking poles. I don't know how well it turns out in these couple of pictures there, but it kind of gives you an extra leg or support as you're climbing. As Jesus sent out the 12 on their first commission, the limited commission found over in Matthew 10, he sent them out with not a whole lot. When you're speaking from a worldly perspective, they really didn't have much to try to get by, and they need to depend on those they preached to for food as they traveled. They had the clothes on their back and the shoes on their feet and a walking staff to go with them. And while that's the most direct physical example of provisioning from the New Testament, it definitely applies at a more spiritual level as well, particularly from Paul's passage to the Ephesians at the end of his book to them in chapter 6, more commonly known as the armor of God. He reminds us there to take the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, and the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit. And the one I skipped there, the one that most applies with hiking, is the shoes of the readiness of the gospel of peace. And the last thing before you go out on your hike is making sure that you know any other details that might impact the hike. Making sure you're dealt to prepare with the hostile environment you're going out into. Things like how big the parking lot is, which determines how early you have to start, what the weather is going to be like, whether you need extra rain or extra sunscreen, how difficult the terrain is, are you physically capable of performing the hike you've chosen, is it a dangerous wildlife area that you need special protections such as bear spray or bear bells for, or is it an area that they don't recommend going out by yourself or that you need at least 4 people for? Mostly it's these last couple of questions that apply the best on a spiritual level. Going back to the limited commission again, this time from the account of it in Mark, it's recorded that Jesus sent them out 2 by 2. He knew they'd be stronger and more effective together, able to support one another, as Solomon suggested in Ecclesiastes. Similarly, Paul, when he went out on his journeys, went with Silas or Barnabas, sometimes Luke, Timothy. Onesimus was mentioned as having been a great strength when he was with him. And then also, there you go. As far as hostile environments, Paul mentions not participating in practices that would be a stumbling block to you or to another. In the specific case on the screen from Romans, it was more so about eating meat sacrificed to idols, but the principle holds well in many other areas today, such as not going into certain stores or participating in conversations on unchristlike topics, environments that might be too hostile for you to survive at your early or your current strength on your Christian walk. So now at this point in the hiking process, you've done all your research, you made your decisions, you have the equipment, you've got everything you need, you're out there bright and early and ready to start taking the first steps. This is the easiest part of the activity. You're fresh and from the car, you're rested, hydrated, not sleepy, not too hot. And similarly, I've noticed that many new Christians are the most excited and the most energetic in sharing the good news with those around them. So then as you start out on the hike, there are several of those factors that I mentioned that you need to be aware of and to deal with in order to stay safe. One of the more dramatic, there we go. Okay, sorry, it's a little twitchy there, is in the Boulder Fields that I mentioned earlier that we had to cross on the way up. As you can see on it, the path really isn't fully marked. You're kind of relying on the person up ahead of you in order to kind of see which way you're going. But to be smart along the way, we had to test each rock to make sure it wasn't going to roll out from underneath us and give us a twisted or sprained ankle. And as we were crossing it, it reminded me a lot of the Bereans in Acts 17. They were instructed in the Word by arguably one of the best preachers, Paul, but they still went back to the Word to test out each new teaching in order to ensure it was sound. And this is a principle we need to continue to embrace today. Anything up here that I'm saying, I hope you guys are going and looking and checking up on me as well. It's way too easy in those kinds of cases when it's not being looked up at for a misguided or dishonest preacher in order to introduce errors and for them to grow. And further, Solomon mentions in Proverbs 16:17 that the one who guards his way preserves his life. He pretty easily could, I think, pulled that from watching or participating in some of the hiking or marches he might have done, but it's easily taken as an example and applies to the need to stay off the evil way. Another major safety factor from our hiking out west that I'm going to mention is the wildlife. There we go. Most of the time it really isn't too dangerous as long as you give it their space, and 9 times out of 10, an elk, even though it's pretty big, isn't going to charge you or bother you or notice you. And bears, despite being deadly, are more opportunists who wouldn't bother you unless you get between them and food or, as more commonly known, between a mother and her cubs. But they are wild and should still be given their space. As a ranger we talked to there put it, a good rule of thumb is that you should be able to put your arm up like this and be able to cover the bison up fully behind your thumb when it's extended out in front of you. And that you should have about even more space than that for animals such as bears that are more dangerous. But when you're hiking out in the woods, it's really not possible all the time to see that far off, so it's pretty common to be able to stumble up on them much closer than that, like we did with the elk there on the bottom left. It was on our trip up to Delta Lake that we came around the corner, and there was that huge elk off the pass having his breakfast. Luckily they're herbivores and it wasn't bugling season, so he wasn't really in any interest in us and he was content to let us go on our way. And later on the trip we saw the bear that's in the top picture up there. Took that one from my iPhone camera, which is a lot closer than they really tell you that you should get to a bear. But luckily we were safe. He was kind of down the hill a little bit from us and was just kind of going by. Because we did hear some stories about her earlier in the week. On that path there was a mom on one side and cubs on the other, so those hikers had to give up and turn around because it was too dangerous to go between them. And when thinking of wildlife and predators in the Bible, a few verses came to mind. Recently we were doing our Bible reading for each day. We came across Daniel 7 and his vision of the beasts who were rushing around, devouring and controlling the earth. But I'm sure the one that probably came to mind most of you when I started talking about predators was from Peter's epistle in 1 Peter 5, where he discusses Satan as a lion seeking to devour us. And we as Christians always need to be ready and on the watch for him. So as we continue on our hike, we are testing out the way and watching out for wild animals. It quickly becomes apparent that the way is getting harder to travel and the crowds are thinning out. When we were over at the Old Faithful area watching it, there were hundreds, if not thousands of people who would crowd around it every 90 minutes or so to watch the geyser. Then on one of the easier of our hikes over at Jenny Lake, you see I'm trying to get some pictures of the pretty scenery around us, and no matter where I get my camera, there's still a bunch of people in my shot. You couldn't swing your arms without hitting somebody else. Why so many on that one? I mean, there were a lot of nice mountain overlooks, a lot of beautiful lakes to see. But why was that one in particular so busy? Well, because it was the easiest. There was, as I mentioned earlier, a boat that you could take across to the base of the mountain. You didn't have to hike the 2 or 3 miles to get to the mountain and then go up it. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with taking that ferry. I mean, we took it on our way back ourselves because we were tired out from getting there. But my point is, as Christians, we need to be aware of when things are too easy, and that we need to be aware that we're going to be on a harder path than those around us. We're trying to get somewhere hard to get to, someplace harder than for some than getting to the eye of a needle. I mean, yes, in that passage, Jesus is talking about getting into the kingdom specifically, but how else is there to get into heaven but going through the kingdom? We need to be ready for a path that's not the easiest, and ready to go right where all the others around us want to go left. Jesus himself told us that there would be those who would be there'd be few that would be on the right path and fewer that would complete the journey, and many that were going the easy way. And so then eventually you hit the halfway point in the hike, and you hit the top, and then you stop gaining elevation, and now you get to take it easy coming back down. I mean, I could make a parallel to, as you're going out, to needing to stay active in the church even when you're getting older, not just gliding out. But hey, I'm on the low side of 30. I'm going to leave it to Dad tonight, since he has a little more experience in that area. No, don't worry, I ran that joke by him ahead of time, so that's okay. More so, my point is that it's not as easy going downhill as I had thought it was going to be. Yeah, going uphill, I got a whole lot more out of breath and had to stop every few minutes on the way up. But on the way down, I started taking new literal meaning behind the words from the hymn that goes, "How sweet to rest on the promises, on solid rock I stand." But the whole way up, we've been telling each other that at least the way down was going to be easier, that it wasn't going to be as bad. But I'll give you a spoiler. It was still a lot of difficult. It might not, I wouldn't really go so far as to say it was harder, but it definitely was a whole different set of muscles going back down. I know I don't really ever practice climbing downstairs a lot, but it's a set of muscles that doesn't see a lot of work. They were screaming pretty bad. And the mental aspect is you need to make sure that as you were coming back down that each footstep was still solid. That's why no matter where we are at in our Christian hike, we can't just take it easy. We can't afford to get cocky. For as Solomon mentioned again in Proverbs 16, we all know that pride goeth before the fall. There was one spot where we watched several people in a row all wipe out and slip and slide down on their bottoms in the same spot, even though they all had their hiking sticks and thought they were going to be just fine with them. And they even saw, there was, like I said, 4 of them in a row, they could see each other, the person in front of them falling down, and then they still wipe out on that same spot. And if anything, that reinforced to me the fallibility of the concept of once saved, always saved. Or the Christians in the New Testament in Acts, there are a few mentioned that still erred after becoming Christians, and they were warned of their need to repent or that they would be lost, such as Simon the Sorcerer over in Acts 8. He was converted at the miracles performed by Philip, but then when he attempted to buy the power that Philip had, he was told to repent. Or also the case of Amos, where he was mentioned as being a worker and amongst the best in Philemon and in Colossians, but in his last mention, in Paul's last epistle of 2 Timothy, he was mentioned as being lost. Poor Demas wandered off the Christian path, and we need to carefully mark his example and make sure that we aren't as well. Now, I think as bad as the steep part of the way down was, I almost think Michelle's least favorite part was the longer slog back to the car. As I mentioned earlier, we had ran out of food on that part, and yet there wasn't anything else we could do about it since we weren't back. You had to keep putting one foot in front of another. And each time, didn't want to pick up that next foot. I wanted to just stop and rest, but knowing if we did, it was going to be that much harder to get up and keep going again. It's not like we could just stop and camp out there for the night. I think from all of his missionary journeys, Paul's probably understood that situation well. He had a lot of trauma, and at one point, point, he was ready to finish so much that the only thing holding him back was the extra help that he could provide to the Christians that he was mentoring, such as the ones over in Philippi that he was writing to. And he referred to the Christian way as a race in 1 Corinthians. And let me tell you that at a certain point in a race, your chest is dying, your legs are dying, you're ready to just collapse, but you put so much effort in that you're not willing to quit until you cross that finish line. And Paul told us that we're to run so as to win the race. And that definitely involves staying committed and finishing and crossing that finish line in 2 Timothy. And if only that verse from Isaiah had been literal at that point, I really would have liked that. But now at this point in the narrative, we are basically back at the car and at the end of the hike. I'm sure that you're wondering why I skipped right over the part of the views at the top. I mean, that's the whole point of the hike and the Mountaintop Experience. Part of that was in order to keep the lesson from getting too long, but also because I was saving the part about the motivation for here at the end. The views from the mountain were breathtaking, and they were totally worth the experience, but they couldn't motivate us all the way back to the car. They might have helped us get up the mountain, but then once we'd seen them, there wasn't anything exciting to see down at the rental Equinox that we had sitting in the gravel lot at the bottom. Similarly, no mountaintop experience in your faith is going to hold you over forever as you go down into the next valley. I mean, yeah, they're wonderful and to be cherished, but you need something stronger to see you through those descents. For us that day, as we were finishing our hike, it was our victory tacos, we called them. We started that day dreaming about where we were going to go out to eat when we got back, and that day we had specifically chosen Mexican, so we were talking victory tacos. And on the way back down, it was getting so I could practically taste them. And how much sweeter is our promised reward, there's the tacos, than tacos. We're promised heaven, the land where we shall be with God forever, where there will be no sickness, no death, no sadness of any kind, as John tells us in Revelation. He continues that it shall be a land of beauty and peace, more beautiful than a city made of gold and with gems for streets. Heaven is the ultimate prize for which we strive, and achieving it to be with God is our motivation for continuing in those days where it gets hard to keep putting one foot in front of another. So there you have it, an overview of our Christian hike, from the beginning of when one hears the gospel, to believing in it, to confession, to baptism in Jesus, to continuing to live faithfully and staying on that path even when the way gets hard, to finally, in the end, making it to our ultimate destination. If there are any here this morning who, in hearing this, have decided that they want to take the Christian hike as well, or who have started the hike in the past and have either stopped or wandered off the trail, or any who just need prayers, please come forward as we stand.